A little-known fact amongst fans of history is that some of the deadliest, most ruthless battles in American history were actually fought between neighboring tribes. In countless examples, the fight for resources, territory, and revenge resulted in some of the most brutal combat ever seen on the North American continent. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we explore some of the deadliest battles in the history of intertribal warfare.
Alberta, Canada, October 25, 1870. Just as the sun crests the horizon on another chilly autumn morning, two young families in a small camp near the Belly River are just beginning to wake. Suddenly, the still morning air is broken by the horrifying sound of muffled, hurried footsteps approaching the two lodges. For a sickening few seconds, this sends a collective chill down the spines of the young fathers, mothers, and children ensconced inside their warm buffalo hide lodges. Scarcely a few moments later, the blinding light of the morning sun pours into the family's lodges as the walls of their teepees are slit open by the attacking Cree warriors, the longtime bitter enemy of the Blackfoot, who swarm into the family's shelters, swiftly dispatching every unfortunate Blackfoot inside, regardless of age or gender. The unfortunate victims are scarcely able to utter a sound before their lives are mercilessly snuffed out at the end of Cree war clubs, knives, and lances. However chaotic, ruthless, and bloody this scene may be, it is seen by the attacking Cree warriors as just retribution. Many among the young warriors are alight with pride and glee. However, several among the attacking party now begin to grow more and more weary about a premonition shared by one of their most respected chiefs less than 24 hours ago. The day prior, the Cree war party had gathered in the middle of the Albertan plains, with several dozen warriors standing in a semicircle around the revered Cree war chief Piapo. Chief Piapo had had a dream, and the dream had given him great concern about proceeding. As the impatient party of young warriors stood skeptically listening to his recounting of the dream, he beseeched them to proceed no further on this raid. He proclaimed that he had seen a giant buffalo with iron horns, and that this buffalo was attacking the entire camp, mauling and killing them wholesale. Piapo is now greatly concerned. But while dreams and visions do indeed hold great sway within the Cree tribe, this does not mean that all visions are created equal, nor that all are to be taken seriously. This party of bellicose young men, regardless of their respect for a veteran war chief, had remained resolutely intent on exacting their revenge for horses stolen and family members killed. The Cree now move on to another group of Blackfoot camped near the river who are all asleep in their teepees in assumed safety. Several Cree warriors stealthily slip within arrow range downwind of these lodges and ruthlessly dispatch the few pet dogs who themselves are just beginning to wake in the morning light. Yet another horrific scene begins to unfold as the Cree descend upon the small encampment. Believing this to be the main Blackfoot contingent, no effort is made to conceal their arrival, nor to muffle their weaponry. Within seconds, the air is filled with the sounds of war cries, gun smoke, and rifle fire. These lodges of the Blackfoot are again slit open, and again, the inhabitants within are ruthlessly cut down. But this time, several Blackfoot manage to flee towards the river. Several are shot down, but more manage to escape over the low rolling hills. As the Cree move on to complete the grim task of finishing off any wounded Blackfoot and looting the camp of any valuables, they pay little consideration to the Blackfoot who have managed to get away. Here on the open prairie, in the freezing cold, they assume the survivors, having fled without blankets or weapons, will ultimately die from exposure to the elements. But the Cree are wrong. These small encampments of Blackfoot families are, in fact, only outliers of a massive Blackfoot village, hundreds of warriors strong, who have now been alerted to the Cree's actions, and are now themselves on the warpath for revenge. This camp represents a coalition of bands known as the Blackfoot Confederacy, made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Northern and Southern Piegan, and, added recently at this point in the 1870s, the Sarcee and Gros Ventre. The most powerful tribe here on the northern plains, the Blackfoot have long dominated the area, and in doing so, have developed a long-standing enmity with many neighboring tribes, none more so than the Cree. The Cree have also formed a conglomeration of bands known as the Iron Confederacy, comprised of the Plains Cree, the Woods Cree, the Saulteaux, the Assiniboine, the Métis, and the Haudenosaunee. They trace their tribal origins to the James Bay area between present-day Ontario and Quebec, on the southern tip of the Hudson Bay. With the incursion of the European fur trade in the 16th century, the Cree were pushed west onto the plains. It had seemed that conflict with the Blackfoot was all but unavoidable, and, to be sure, it had been. The rivalry between the Blackfoot and the Cree is one born, like many intertribal conflicts, out of a scarcity of land and resources. For centuries, the two peoples have conducted these raids against one another in the fight to secure hunting grounds, to uphold tribal honor, and to exact their retribution in what seems to be an inexorable cycle of violence and vengeance. The Blackfoot, being the larger tribe, had often gotten the better of these clashes, and now they will seek to bring to bear the full might of their forces in defending their village and in punishing their attackers. Back at the site of their second attack, as the Cree pour through the spoils of their raid, several among them suddenly stop, stand fully upright, and listen intently. Somewhere, not far beyond the ridges that line the Belly River, hoofbeats are rapidly approaching their position. The cry suddenly goes out amongst the victorious Cree that more Blackfoot are now on the way. From where, they do not know, but every man among them now scrambles to his weapons and makes ready to fight. In mere minutes, the small river valley is suddenly flooded with hundreds of horse-bound Blackfoot warriors, all descending upon the Cree position at full speed. The Cree, now suddenly on the defensive, take whatever cover they can in the bottom of the valley near the river, and then hunker down in order to make a desperate bid for their own lives. For hours, a vicious close-quarters fight unfolds, as the Blackfoot seek to ensure that not a single transgressing Cree warrior survives. Time and again, Blackfoot warriors charge the Cree position, pouring arrows and bullets in among them, killing dozens. Finally, with all hope seemingly lost, many of the Cree attempt to swim across the Belly River to at least put the body of water between themselves and their attackers. But these warriors are quickly spotted by a half-blooded Blackfoot scout named Jerry Potts. Potts had been born in 1840 inside Montana's Fort McKenzie, the only son of a Cree mother and a Scottish fur trader father. After his father's death when he was still a young boy, his mother had rejoined the Cree and given custody of the young Potts to Alexander Harvey of the American Fur Company. Sadly, Harvey had turned out to be a cruel caretaker, eventually abandoning Potts in 1845. Later that same year, Potts had been adopted by a kindly fur trapper, also from the American Fur Company, a man named Andrew Dawson. After spending his formative years under Dawson's care, Potts would eventually rejoin his mother with the Cree tribe. Here, he would complete all of their rites of passage, becoming a full-fledged member of the tribe, though he still preferred to clothe himself in mostly European garb. However, Potts had gone on to marry 2 Blackfoot women and had many children within the tribe. By 1870, he had been made a chief in the Kainai band and had amassed a considerable fortune as well as a respected reputation during his time with the tribe. Potts now alerts his Blackfoot comrades to the attempted escape, and he and the rest of the Blackfoot warriors descend upon the Cree in the river like a pack of wolves upon a wounded bison. Now, much like the unfortunate Blackfoot whom the Cree had killed while they attempted to slog their way through the river to safety, the Cree themselves are now slaughtered wholesale along the banks of the river. In his later account of the battle, Potts recalled the Cree being so thickly gathered upon the riverbanks that one could, quote, close their eyes and pull the trigger and still manage to dispatch them one by one. Only a few dozen Cree, out of the 100-strong attacking force, managed to escape the charnel house of the steep river banks, now fleeing onto the expanses of the open Albertan prairie. A large force of Blackfoot, loath to let any of their aggressors escape, now immediately take to pursuing the remaining Cree, who are making their way in a dead sprint towards a sparse, small thicket of brush. The majority of these warriors are cut down before reaching the relative cover of the thicket. As their comrades fall to the left and to the right of them, the few surviving Cree who managed to make it to the thicket now hunker down as the horrifying spectacle of a cyclonic Blackfoot attack seemingly engulfs them from all angles. Finally, though, seeing that there are so few Cree left, the Blackfoot eventually take their leave, heading back to their grieving village and to the bodies of the vanquished. They stop at the corpse of each freshly slain Cree in order to claim their rightful trophies of war in the way of usable goods, trinkets, and scalps. The bodies are then summarily and thoroughly mutilated in order to further punish their attackers. Back at the river, the water now runs red with the blood of both Cree and Blackfoot, an immediate, visceral reminder of the horrors that have just occurred. The stench of death permeates the small valley, and the cries of grieving Blackfoot women fill the air. Though confrontations like this one have gone on for decades, if not centuries, between the tribes of the Canadian Plains, this fight, known to history as the Battle of Belly River, will go down in history as the largest and the last intertribal battle in Canadian history. In 1871, the year following the battle, a treaty will be struck between the Blackfoot and the Cree, officially ending the ongoing war between the two tribes. The tribes of the Northern Plains lived in an unforgiving reality, where resources were finite and territory was everything. And thus, as is universally the case with the human condition, conflicts inevitably arose. But the many tales of the hundreds, if not thousands of intertribal battles that occurred on the Great Plains of North America are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southwestern Nebraska, August 5th, 1873. A group of Pawnee hunters crouched low in the prairie grass so as not to betray their silhouettes against the pre-dawn skyline. They are led by a respected tribal leader, Sky Chief. Amongst the hunters is Sky Chief's young son, a young boy who is no more than 6 or 7 years old. Though too young to participate in this hunt, he is excited and proud to be along with this group of grown men whom he idolizes and so often emulates. Their quarry on this summer morning is a herd of buffalo, several hundred strong, from which the Pawnee hope to harvest a sizable bounty of hides, horns, and hooves, as well as stores of invaluable meat, organs, and fat that will see them through another harsh plains winter. The Pawnee had once been a formidable force on the central plains of the North American continent. In the early 1700s, they had numbered 60,000 people and controlled vast swaths of what is today the American Midwest. But after almost 2 centuries of disease and warfare, their numbers have dwindled to a few thousand. By 1873, they have acquiesced to the U.S. government's attempt to confine them to reservation lands in Nebraska. This buffalo hunt, a long-standing tradition amongst the tribe, had only been granted to them in the previous few years as a final opportunity to practice their ways and to fortify their winter food supply at little to no cost to the federal government. The year prior, in 1872, they had been accompanied by a contingent of agency scouts led by Texas Jack Umahundro, a legendary scout, cowboy, eventual actor, and longtime friend of Buffalo Bill Cody. As the agency scouts stood watch and provided protection to the camp, The Pawnee men were able to venture out to hunt without fear of retributive attacks from their longtime enemy, the Lakota. Under the watchful eye of well-armed sentries, the Pawnee had managed to procure enough buffalo meat to get them through the upcoming winter. However, the Lakota had raided their reservation incessantly during the winter of 1872 to 1873, and the Pawnee suffered greatly as a result. In the springtime, the Pawnee chiefs conferred and decided that another hunt was indeed wholly necessary for the survival of their tribe. They petitioned the federal agents of the reservation for another contingent of scouts. They requested that these scouts be led by Texas Jack, as he had comported himself so reputably during the summer prior, and thus solidified a lifelong respect and companionship between himself and the Pawnee. But in the interim time between the summer of 1872 and the spring of 1873, several major changes had occurred in the administration of the Pawnee Reservation, known as the Genoa Agency. First, a new superintendent had been installed. His name was William Burgess, and like his predecessors since 1869, he was a Quaker. President Ulysses S. Grant had installed Quakers as Indian agents in the hopes that contact with pacifist, peaceable whites would quell the raging frontier violence that had plagued the continent for centuries and stalled American expansion for decades. Grant, in fact, believed that the root cause of much of the violence on the bleeding frontier was due to the treatment of the native tribes by the overly aggressive, needlessly bellicose, and haplessly short-sighted settlers. He hoped this plan would stem the tide of violence that, at times, seemed like it might overrun a third of the country, but he would be gravely disappointed. From the very start, William Burgess had not inspired confidence in his leadership abilities. Luther North, a revered member of the Scouts that had served the reservation, described Burgess as woefully unqualified, noting that, quote, "His judgment where the Pawnee are concerned, if anything, is poorer than any of the other agents the Pawnees have had." Burgess had attempted to address the terrible situations at the reservation by passing out annual rations earlier than promised, but this proved an inadequate solution to the poverty and starvation that plagued the tribe. Feeling as though he had little other feasible course of action, Burgess authorized the tribe to travel to the Republican River in hopes of repeating the previous year's hunting success and placating the Pawnee for one last year until they could be brought fully to bear as idealized American citizens. The plans for the excursion began in late spring, with the initial intent being to repeat the steps taken in the previous year's hunt. Texas Jack was asked to lead the agency's scouting party, and a wave of much-needed hopefulness spread through the desperate, hungry camp as spring turned to summer. However, due to an administrative oversight on behalf of the reservation agents, the Pawnee were ultimately unable to secure Texas Jack's services. Though he had repeatedly applied to lead the Pawnee party, no word had come in return. With no confirmatory word from the Genoa Agency, Texas Jack had signed on to appear in Buffalo Bill Cody's stage show in New York, and was thus drawn away by his new obligation. The Pawnee, now bereft of an agency representative they considered trustworthy in the field, beseeched Burgess to grant the position to a 22-year-old Wisconsin-born homesteader named John W. Williamson. Williamson had signed on that spring as an agriculturalist for Fort Genoa, and had solidified a mutually congenial relationship with the Pawnee. He had no experience in guiding on the trail, no experience in the territory, and spoke only passable Pawnee, and, being all too keenly aware of these facts himself, had never applied for nor expressed any interest in leading the Pawnee hunting expedition. The Pawnee hoped that this might work in their favor, as Williamson's lack of territorial and tactical wherewithal would likely mean drastically less strict practices than those employed by Texas Jack. This hunt could very well be their last hurrah on the Great Plains, and the Pawnee did not want it interfered with by what they viewed as an overly restrictive white man, no matter how reputable, well-liked, and well-intentioned Texas Jack may have been. Burgess, believing he had no better immediate options, acquiesced to the Pawnee's request for Williamson to be installed as the nominal leadership. The Pawnee had ventured out from Fort Genoa in a party of roughly 400, mostly women and children. They had made their way, in high spirits, to the hunting grounds on the Republican River, believing themselves adequately protected and free of some of the previous year's more burdensome restrictions. Initially, the hunt had been a rousing success. In the month of hunting leading up to this day, the Pawnee had managed to harvest roughly 800 buffalo. Each animal killed means a measure of security for their families, and all present have, thus far, been pleased with their progress. On this day, though, something is different. The air seems unusually thick, and the buffalo more skittish than usual. The evening prior, a group of white buffalo hunters had stopped by the Pawnee encampment. They had warned Williamson and Sky Chief that they had seen a large encampment of the Pawnee's mortal enemy, the Lakota, 25 miles upriver. They had warned that the Lakota party was clearly on the warpath and undoubtedly on the hunt for the Pawnee. Word had spread quickly amongst the Lakota that the Pawnee were back this summer on the Republican River, lands that the Lakota hold to be rightfully theirs. The white hunters had warned that the Lakota were out for blood. Sky Chief had scoffed at this notion and decried the hunters as simply more lying white men, trying to keep him and his people from their rightful hunting grounds. But now, as he hunkers down watching the buffalo herd and mindfully keeping his young son close to him, Sky Chief begins to wonder if those hunters had in fact been telling the truth. Then, he hears the hoofbeats. Suddenly, a party of 50 Lakota warriors on horseback and in full war regalia crests the ridge behind the Pawnee. Almost instantaneously, the two parties, Lakota and Pawnee, are in sight of each other. Some accounts have Sky Chief and his warriors as being in the middle of skinning some of the buffalo they have already killed. However, in either account, the Pawnee have been caught wholly unprepared to defend themselves. It is clear to Sky Chief at a moment's glance that this small party of Lakota are the initial scouts sent out to find and make first contact with the Pawnee. He knows that the contingent now attacking himself and his warriors is likely but a fraction of the entire Lakota force. As the Lakota let loose their piercing war cries and barrel down the ridge towards them, the Pawnee hunting party knows there will be no surviving this morning. Within moments, Sky Chief, his young son, and the remainder of his forces are cut down. The Lakota will later report taking no prisoners from this attack, leaving all Pawnee present lying still in death. Having located their enemy, the Lakota reconnaissance party of roughly 50 warriors makes their way back to the main contingent of Lakota, roughly 1,000 strong, hidden behind a bluff a few miles away. After being alerted by the reconnaissance party, this larger war party, under the leadership of War Chiefs Littletail and the aptly named Pawnee Killer, immediately ride out towards the remainder of the Pawnee. The remaining Pawnee, with only 100 warriors left and the rest being women and children, are making their way down a canyon near the Republican River when the Lakota smash into them in a whirlwind of violence and bloodshed. The battle that further ensues is unbelievably fierce, with every man present knowing that the fate of his family would be the same as that of Sky Chief, his men, and his young son. Though they fight valiantly, the majority of the Pawnee warriors are simply and quickly overwhelmed and cut down. Williamson and two older Pawnee men managed to make an escape back to the west in hopes of linking up with the nearest U.S. Army element in the area and procuring assistance. However, they will not make it back in time. The surviving Pawnee women and children have retreated into the canyon and are now trapped within its recesses. One by one, young and old are ruthlessly hunted down and taken prisoner, or immediately dispatched at the end of Lakota arrows and lances. Though many are cut down, many are taken prisoner, all of them knowing that their fates now will likely be worse than their deceased comrades. Any valuables that can be carried are tied down to Lakota horses. Then, almost as suddenly as they had struck, the entire party of Lakota with their newly taken trophies and prisoners in tow, are off, over the hills, and seemingly free from worry of pursuit or retribution. Only hours later, in the afternoon of August 5th, U.S. cavalry soldiers who had been alerted by Williamson and his cohorts arrive on the scene. Riding with them is Army Dr. David Franklin Powell. Surveying the horrific scene, he counts 59 Pawnee bodies. Visitors from nearby towns, who have been alerted to the events and come to see the aftermath themselves, count there to be significantly more. Correspondent Royal Buck of the Nebraska City News wrote that it was a massacre and nothing more, and nearly 100 victims are lying on the ground, and 2/3 are squaws and papooses, small Indian children. On August 8th, news of the massacre reaches the Pawnee back at the Genoa Agency. For days afterwards, the fort is a cacophonous scene as the weeping and lamentations of the Pawnee women fill the air. Meanwhile, a few Pawnee who have managed to escape the canyon make their way 80 miles to what's known as Plum Creek, an offshoot of the Platte River. Here, they are tended to by Dr. William M. Bancroft, and then put on a train back to Fort Genoa. For weeks afterwards, Lakota warriors are spotted in various camps about the prairies, proudly displaying their war trophies. In a visceral display of the generations-long enmity between the two tribes, it is apparent to outside observers that what had been a horrific massacre to the Pawnee was a just and necessary victory in the eyes of the Lakota, one that, by its very nature, warranted great pride and celebration. Lakota accounts of the battle report as many as 300 Pawnee being killed, with no Lakota casualties being taken. The events of Massacre Canyon in 1873 are, to be sure, unique, but not in their level of ferocity, nor in the scope of their violence, nor in the intensity of the disdain between the two tribes, nor the grief inflicted and suffered by both. Instead, Massacre Canyon will be unique in the history of the Old West because it will mark the last great battle between Plains tribes on the North American continent. However, in the scope of history, the stories of warfare, raiding, violence, and atrocities between tribes are too numerous to cover in one episode. For tonight, those are other stories for other times. Montana, 1833. From atop one of the two small buildings inside of Fort McKenzie, Prince Alexander Philipp Maximilian Zuvidnevit, renowned German explorer, naturalist, and ethnologist, peers on at a scene that his years of study, travel, and training have still not sufficiently prepared him for. Stretched out before him are hundreds of native warriors, members of the Cree and Assiniboine tribes, replete with their war paint and feathered headdresses. In any other circumstance, the cerebral Deutschman would likely have found himself entranced with the pageantry and spectacle before him. But, on this particular occasion, he feels an eerie dread creep over him. In the quiet still of the oncoming sunrise, the Cree and Assiniboine warriors continue to breach the horizon, pouring towards the fort and, more directly, to the small encampment of Blackfoot men, women, and children camped outside of the fort's walls. The blood feud between the Blackfoot and the Cree, as well as the Cree's allies the Assiniboine, is decades old and viciously deep, though it has gone largely unseen and unrecorded by ethnographers such as Prince Maximilian. The accounts that do exist from survivors of intertribal raiding in the area paint harrowing tales of total warfare, in which men, women, and children alike are cut down or taken captive and made slaves. Countless times on the open plains, a camp of unsuspecting natives has been overtaken in a surprise dawn raid by their rivals and subjected to violent torment and death to the point of near eradication. Oftentimes, the genesis of the conflict involved territorial rights to hunting grounds, which could spell the difference in life and death for bands of wandering nomad tribes. Though the exact cause of this most recent rivalry between the tribes is unknown, the ramifications of the ongoing conflict have echoed across the prairie for years. Were it not for its eventual effect on the fur trade, the conflict may have gone entirely unnoticed by the French, English, and American fur traders who deal so closely with the tribes. It had been the fur trade that had driven the establishment of Fort McKenzie, here in what is the present-day state of Montana. American Fur Company merchant David Mitchell had selected this site 6 miles north of the Marias River in hopes of establishing a central locale from which to conduct trade with local tribes. Mitchell had constructed the fort, comprised of 2 blockhouses inside of a roughly 50-yard by 50-yard square enclosed with a timbered fence, and named it in honor of his boss at the American Fur Company, Kenneth McKenzie. Prince Maximilian and his longtime cohort, famed frontier artist Carl Bodmer, a 24-year-old Swiss-French printmaker, etcher, lithographer, zinc engraver, draftsman, painter, illustrator, and hunter, have spent the past few weeks at Fort McKenzie, making observations and illustrations. Bodmer has already built himself a formidable reputation, and has been in the process of building a rapport with the Blackfoot bands who come to trade at the fort, and made camp outside of its walls. Prince Maximilian has also spent considerable time amongst the Blackfoot, building friendships and noting the differences in the several bands of Blackfoot that comprise the larger tribe, as well as its many complex warrior societies. He has, in fact, been the first ethnographer to record these differences, counting there to be 7 men's societies in total, grading by age, with the lowest being the Mosquito Society and the highest being the Bull Society. Other societies included the Bee Society, the Dog Society, the Crow Society, and the Kit Fox Society. Maximilian had also gone to great pains to learn anything of the religion or faith practices of this enigmatic Northern Plains warrior tribe. But in this case, his efforts had proven fruitless, much to his frustration. So much so, in fact, that he had made note of it in his journal. Mr. Berger, the interpreter, who was otherwise well acquainted with the Blackfoot Indians, could not give me any information respecting their religious ideas, further than that they worship the sun. However, while Maximilian and Bodmer had spent the preceding few weeks observing and conversing with the Blackfoot in hopes of furthering their cultural understanding, their compatriot and tireless entrepreneur David Mitchell has spent his time making overtures of goodwill towards the Blackfoot in efforts to establish stronger trading ties and better deals for himself and the American Fur Company. He has, thus far, been rather successful, as the Blackfoot rightfully discern his effort to, at least in some part, be in good faith, as he seems to truly care for and about their people, treating them with respect in all of their prior dealings. Now, a breathless Mitchell scrambles to the top of one of the fort's buildings, joining Maximilian and Bodmer for a better vantage point of the scene about to unfold. Initially, all 3 men are plagued by a sense of foreboding, as it is unclear whether the Cree and Assiniboines' target is the Blackfoot village or the fort. They also share a sense of hopelessness, as their friends and new comrades in the Blackfoot are camped too far away from the fort's walls to enable them to escape the oncoming force of attacking warriors. It is apparent within moments that the attacker's trajectory is directed straight towards the Blackfoot, and that the object of this morning's attack will not necessarily be the raiding of this fort, but the exacting of yet another round of retribution in an ongoing tribal feud. The scene that is about to unfold is one that few white observers have ever been privy to, but the stories of such battles have permeated the local folklore so stringently that the tales of wailing captive slaves, shattered lives, and torture killings are all but ubiquitous here on the northern plains. Now, as nearly all the inhabitants of the fort work to prepare for a residual attack that may still indeed be on its way, most among them lose the internal struggle not to watch the events before them unfold. The Blackfoot, however, do not have the luxury of preparation nor reflection. As the women and children make desperate runs for the fort, and the men prepare to make their defensive stand, riders are sent to the nearby, much larger Blackfoot camp, located 8 to 10 miles up the Marias River. As the Cree and Assiniboines smash into the smaller Blackfoot camp, a vicious battle unfolds. Many of the women and children who have been unable to flee are cut down in their lodges, the victims of Cree and Assiniboine lances and clubs. The Blackfoot warriors, themselves exhausted from a night of celebratory drinking and dancing, put up a brutal defense of their own, and as the roar of gunfire resounds, and the camp is filled with the shrieks of attackers and victims alike, the fight unfolds in a scene of utter chaos and inhumanity. However, the Blackfoot's staunch defense soon bears fruit, as reinforcements from the nearby Blackfoot camp begin to flood into this camp. In another excerpt from his journal, Maximilian himself recalls the scene in his own words. The reinforcements came galloping in groups, from 3 to 20 together, their horses covered with foam from exhaustion, and they themselves in their finest apparel, with all kinds of ornaments and arms, bows and quivers on their backs, guns in their hands, furnished with their medicines, with their feathers on their heads, and a large hood of feathers hanging down behind, the upper part of their bodies partly naked, and carrying shields adorned with feathers and pieces of colored cloth. The tide of battle shifts dramatically as the Cree and Assiniboine are caught off guard and nearly encircled. The newly arrived warriors, incensed at the attack of their fellow tribespeople, now sweep down upon any enemy warriors they can find, cutting them down with their lances as if they are on a buffalo hunt. Back at the fort, Mitchell and a number of other trappers and hunters have reached their fill of watching Blackfoot women and children, many of whom they have grown close to and know by name, cut down at the hands of Cree and Assiniboine warriors. Laden down with extra ammunition and their own rifles, the small troop of men now floods out of the gates and into the fray of the battle unfolding several hundred yards away. They too sweep down upon the Cree and Assiniboine attackers, firing at will upon any that present themselves as targets. Now, the chaos of the battle only intensifies, as fleeing warriors are cut off and cut down without mercy. Finally, the surviving Cree and Assiniboine flee over the horizon, with this attack having gone awry. Now, a flood of both relief and despair fall over the camp, as loved ones flood back into the village from the fort, many cleaving to the bodies of those who have been killed. Wailing and moaning fill the air, as many of the Blackfoot who had been sleeping peacefully only hours before now find themselves trapped in the midst of seemingly bottomless grief. Then, after an initial wave of sadness has washed over the Blackfoot, the tone changes to one of anger. The dead Cree and Assiniboine warriors lying scattered about the village are now made the target of the Blackfoot's thirst for vengeance. Their bodies are grievously mutilated in the ritual style of plains warfare, with additional indignities being wrought upon their attackers even as they lie still in death. Maximilian himself describes the scene. The men fired guns into the bodies. The women and children beat them with clubs and pelted them with stones, and the fury of the latter was particularly directed against the privy parts. The Blackfoot wounded now also seek refuge and medical assistance inside the fort, which they readily receive. Mitchell and the trappers who rushed out to assist the Blackfoot are now embraced for their efforts as brothers. Even Corral is credited by Old Bear Chief himself for preserving his life. The chief believes that, because the artist had painted his portrait mere days before, this had protected him in the battle. Bodmer, for his part, wisely offers no refutation to this. Bodmer will go on to paint a vivid portrait of the battle he has just witnessed, one which captures the diversity in both tribes' weaponry and dress. Though the battle is over, the ramifications will be long-lasting. The tentative peace that had been formally negotiated by David McKenzie between the Blackfoot and the Assiniboine has been effectively shattered, and the effects will not only be felt here on the high plains, but in the fur markets of the East Coast and Europe. The coming decades will see much change, not only in the dynamics of intertribal relations and the economic consequences that result, but in the actual number of native peoples populating the plains. Though they have already experienced significant damage from diseases such as smallpox and cholera, the coming years will see some tribes on the northern plains suffer mortality rates as high as 50 to 90%. This would change the cultural, demographic, and political landscape of the northern plains and the whole of North America to a degree seldom seen before in human history. However, the tales of the great sorrows suffered on the high plains, as well as the countless tales of bravery, selflessness, camaraderie,
and ruthlessness that abound in the history of human conflict are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Southern Montana, 1820. In the hue of the early morning light, a village of the mighty Crow tribe stirs in apprehension of an attack that is soon to come. Their chief, an esteemed veteran warrior named Longhair, surveys the surrounding area, replete with hills and thick timber, looking for any signs of the enemy that lurk somewhere outside the confines of the village. They have come here, to this area just south of the Yellowstone River, in order to make a seasonal headquarters of sorts, in which hunters from the tribe can venture out onto the plains and return with their bounties, without requiring their families to leave the relative safety of this slightly more wooded and hilly area. Here on the high plains, the fight for survival is one waged not only against privation and hunger, but against other tribes as well. Though, in these early decades of the 19th century, incursion from Americans and Europeans has been a constant for decades, the primary opponent the Crow have waged war on for years now is their northern and easterly neighbors, the Sioux and Cheyenne. The year prior to this, in 1819, the Crow had suffered a devastating defeat not far from here at the hands of the allied forces of Sioux and Cheyenne, themselves having banded together against the Crows in interest of driving out their mutual enemy. The day prior to this, a band of Crow warriors from this village had ventured out into the wilds in search of their hated enemies, but in a sickening twist of fate, had unknowingly passed a band of Sioux and Cheyenne in the area. That band of Sioux and Cheyenne are themselves intent on attacking this village of Crow. Late in the evening, a scout had come rushing into the Crow village, his head bloodied from an encounter with the Sioux and Cheyenne. The scout warned the village that the war party was on its way, and all who could be convinced to flee and take cover in the surrounding landscape did so immediately. Those who remained worked feverishly to construct timbered breastworks along the village perimeter, in an attempt to solidify any cover for themselves that they can. Chief Longhair has stayed in the village, and now he and only a few of the remaining Crow warriors, mostly old men and teenagers, face the coming onslaught. Only a few miles away, the party of Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, under the command of a Cheyenne war chief named Ice, makes their way towards the Crow village. The Cheyenne, in particular, are noted for their various warrior societies, composed of warriors who adhere to certain traditions, oaths, modes of behavior, and dress. Ice, a veteran warrior, belongs to perhaps the most curious group among these, a cohort of warriors known as the Contrary Society. Though all manner of extraordinary claims surround this mysterious group, including that they walk backwards and say no when they mean yes, it is true that they wear their war headdresses backwards. In Ice's case, this manifests in the form of a prairie dog skin, worn flapping down over his forehead. Cloaked in only moccasins and a breechclout, he is otherwise painted completely red, in the style of the Contrary Society. He rides atop his trusted war pony, also painted red. In his left hand, covered in a wolf-hide sheath, Ice carries what is known as the Thunderbow Lance, an item considered to carry powerful medicine for making war. Like a pack of wolves on the hunt, the party of warriors skulks their way quietly through the countryside, scarcely making a sound. Their scouts have spotted the Crow village, seemingly oblivious to their presence, and now, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, burning for glory and vengeance against their hated enemies, make their way towards the target, seeking to satiate their hunger for respect and revenge. Finally, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors crest the hill overlooking Longhair's village. There is, however, no swift charge to take the Crow by surprise. Instead, a small contingent of Crow villagers first notice a line of enemy warriors forming on the ridge above their village. Quickly, a cry goes out for the men to arm themselves and for the women and children to take cover. Still, though, Ice and his warriors, themselves adorned and painted according to their respective warrior societies, only watch on, silently observing the chaos unfold below them with a sense of immense satisfaction. Then, suddenly, with a barely discernible flick of his left wrist, Ice unsheathes the Thunderbow Lance. A moment later,
an utter cacophony rises up from all the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors, as Ice raises the lance high above his head. This signals the sacred arrow priest, a Cheyenne man named Dog-Face Medicine Man, to carry out the ceremony of the sacred arrows. This is done with the medicine man offering up the traditional incantations in an unhurried, business-like fashion. Meanwhile, the Crow villagers scramble to take cover behind the ad hoc breastworks they had constructed the previous day. Chief Longhair directs his few warriors to take their places, as the women ready their children to make a run into the woods should all seem lost. What is at stake is known to all, young and old. Plains warfare is not for the faint of heart, with virtually all fighting-age males, especially those unfortunate enough to be captured alive, being killed without question. The women and children lucky enough to survive the attack would find their old lives to be distant memories, as their best hope for the remainder of their lives would be to avoid abject servitude by being adopted into their captor's tribe. This long-standing enmity was born out of the brutal nature of the struggle to survive in these harsh environs, and fomented by the necessity of war as a means of social mobility within warrior cultures. Raids like these are not only commonplace, but a critical component of societal structure among many Plains tribes. Still, the visceral, bloody nature of raiding, even in the unforgiving world of the High Plains, seldom, if ever, becomes a banal experience for any of those involved. Now, as the horrified screams of the women and children lilt upwards towards his position on the hill, Ice again raises the thunderbow lance in his left hand, signaling his warriors to be ready to charge. There is still, however, one point of unfinished business, a matter of honor, that Ice must fulfill before he and his men can strike the Crow village. A veteran Cheyenne warrior named Two Twists, his hair worn in 2 long braids, rides forward to the front of the line. He, too, is covered in war paint and carries a large rawhide shield on his left arm. In his right hand, he carries a large steel Spanish saber. Two Twists has made a vow to his grandfather, a respected Cheyenne chief named Red Painted Robe, that he would avenge the loss of the old man's beloved son to the Crows the year prior by being the first and only warrior to broach the perimeter of the next Crow village he and his cohorts were able to find. Now, in keeping with his vow, Two Twists raises his saber high above his head, begins to sing his death song, and urges his war pony forwards towards the Crow village at a full gallop. To the whoops and cheers of his Sioux and Cheyenne comrades, Two Twists bears down upon the Crow breastworks, now the lone rider in the no-man's land between the Sioux and Cheyenne on the top of the hill and the Crow village at the bottom. As he comes within range of the Crow village, a hailstorm of bullets and arrows fired by the beleaguered force of aged men and young defenders fly all around him. Yet, miraculously, Two Twists remains untouched, as he charges forward undaunted, seeming only to gain speed with his downhill trajectory. In mere seconds, Two Twists' pony jumps the timbered breastworks of the Crow, situating him, alone, squarely in the middle of a group of dozens of Crow villagers. He rides through the crowd and, still at top speed, decapitates an unfortunate lone Crow warrior he manages to separate from the crowd. With his mount, his weapon, and his own body now covered in blood, he wheels his horse around and, again jumping the Crow fortifications, makes a mad, victorious dash back towards the cheering Sioux and Cheyenne lines. Two Twists arrives safely back to the lines of his tribesmen, as they exhort his bravery with shrill cries and whoops of admiration. Now wide-eyed and coursing with adrenaline, Two Twists pauses only momentarily to let his horse catch its breath before again thumping his moccasined feet into the animal's ribs, beginning yet another one-man charge. Again, he charges, saber held aloft, and again crests the defenses of the Crow. But this time, Chief Longhair and the desperate Crow defenders meet him by swarming upon his horse and smothering the animal's progress before managing to unseat Two Twists and pull him to the ground. He then disappears under a wave of Crow fists and clubs. Now, Ice and his comrades in the Sioux and Cheyenne, seeing his plight, let loose cries of rage that resound through the surrounding hills. Ice now raises the thunderbow lance and then lowers it, pointing squarely at the Crow village. The instant this signal is given, the Sioux and Cheyenne warriors make their charge, their horses thundering towards the diminutive Crow defenses. Again, Chief Longhair and his contingent of teenagers and elderly men launch a volley of musket fires and arrows at their attackers. But, again, their efforts make little effect, as the Sioux and Cheyenne pour over and tear down the Crow defensive works, killing any fighting-age male or resisting Crow in their path. The Crows now split into several separate groups, which huddle together in defense and make a last-ditch effort to attempt to get their women and children to safety. One of these groups, with Chief Longhair in command, manages to make their way to the outskirts of the village, then begins to make a desperate sprint for the hills. Chief Longhair and the remaining warriors in this group make a heartened stand against the small group of Sioux and Cheyenne who break off from the village to attack them, and the chief and this group are in fact able to slip away into the cover of the timber. Unfortunately for the Crow remaining in the village, there is now no chance of escape, and they are left to draw the full ire of their Sioux and Cheyenne attackers. As the bodies of their friends and kinsmen are scalped, the women and children are gathered up and taken prisoner. Some of the elderly women are sent away and told to find their people and report to them what has taken place here. One of these women, completely blind, begs for the release of her daughter, who she says acts as her only helper in life. In a show of mercy, the woman's daughter is freed and allowed to accompany her mother on their flight. The Crow men who have been captured, however, are shown no such clemency. To a man, they are all put to death at the end of lances and clubs, as their friends and families helplessly watch on. Then, after the Crow village is looted, the captives are secured, and the trophies of war properly claimed by each warrior, Ice and his band of warriors disappear over the hill, with the only trace of the Crow village now being the empty shells of its lodges and the weeping and lamentations of the prisoners. Great glory has been won this day, perhaps most prominently by Two Twists, who had in fact managed to fight his way out of the swarm of Crow defenders and carry on the attack with his fellow warriors. He will go on to become not only a legendary warrior, but a revered chief. Meanwhile, Chief Longhair and his band of survivors will indeed, in the next few days, find and rejoin the band of warriors that had left their village in search of the very Sioux and Cheyenne who had attacked. The torrent of grief and sorrow that must have been unleashed at the news of the attack and the resulting devastation can only be imagined, though its exact recollections will go unrecorded. What will be remembered, however, is the storm of violence that is about to be unleashed, at levels never before seen by either faction, between the Crow and the allied forces of the Sioux and Cheyenne. But the many tales of the brutal battles that will unfold in the wake of this bloody affair between age-old enemies on North America's high plains are, for tonight, other stories for other times.
Thank you again for joining us. If you like this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the HOKC newsletter. Link is in the description below. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.